All right, we are right at the top of the hour. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jessica Duncan. I'm the VP of Sales at LighthouseAI, a pharma solutions company. And we welcome you to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the recently passed Alabama House Bill 79 legislation and the implications it may have for other states. We're delighted to have you join us today, but before we dive into the main content, we'd like to provide you with some additional information to ensure that you have a smooth and enjoyable webinar experience. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand at a later date. You will receive an email notification link to access the recording once. By default, all attendees' audio and video are muted to minimize background noise and distractions. The chat function will also be disabled for today's webinar. However, you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A feature, which can be found at the bottom of the Zoom window. Our team will address your questions during the designated Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. Once again, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy the webinar and find the information valuable. To introduce today's speakers, Sumeet Singh is the founder and CEO of LighthouseAI. Sumeet brings boots on the ground experience to LighthouseAI's product development, directly managing compliance activities for multiple drug wholesalers for the first 5 years of his career, and growing pharma solutions for the last 7. It is from his experiences with pharma solutions that he has launched LighthouseAI. Presenting with Sumeet today is Kelly DeBattista Esquire, LighthouseAI's Director of Research. Kelly is an admitted attorney in New York and brings 8 years of pharmaceutical regulatory and compliance research and industry experience. Kelly recently crossed over from Pharma Solutions to LighthouseAI in order to assist in his product development. Get started, Sumeet.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jessica, and welcome, Kelly. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to everybody else on the webinar today. So we're honored and excited to have over 200 registrants, and I think we just crossed over, well over the triple digits as far as participants. Everybody, including 4 boards of pharmacy, over 40 manufacturers, 60 wholesalers, 10 3PLs, and over 30 pharmacies and providers, as well as consulting agencies, tech companies, law firms, and more. So to that end, a couple of disclaimers. First and foremost is that LighthouseAI is not a law firm, and the information provided here is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not create a lawyer-client relationship. The information provided is subject to change and is intended for use as informative industry knowledge. Secondly, because we have so many, such a variety of participants, LighthouseAI asks that each of us remember the U.S. and other government antitrust laws, which are designed to prevent competitors from colluding on practices that affect prices, fees, or the ability of others to compete. LighthouseAI asks that any client during any meeting involving competitors refrain from any discussion or any other actions that could have an anti-competitive effect. If at any point you feel that discussion has drifted into inappropriate areas, you should bring it to the attention of the person chairing the meeting. If the discussion continues, you should remove yourself from the meeting and ask that the minutes reflect that fact. First time I've had to do that, but here we are. So we have an action-packed agenda for you guys today. First, we're going to start over with an overview just to kind of set the stage a little bit, go over the DSCSA and FDA proposed rules. I promise it'll be one slide and one slide each, and that's it. Next, we'll have Kelly dive into the Alabama House Bill 79, what recently passed and what impact it has. Next, I'll get into the heated debate of floor versus ceiling, which is really, kind of the big, stickiness and really the focus of this presentation. And then finally, we'll focus on upcoming changes and how to navigate forthcoming regulatory changes. So before we start the presentation, the webinar, if anybody has joined my webinars for the past 8 years, you'll know that I always like to start off with a poll. So the first poll that I'm going to launch is, it's actually 2 questions. So the first one is going to be, who handles state regulatory compliance for your organization? If you can just click on the screen. There's a variety of choices between internal, external, a combination of all of the above, and then other and not applicable. So as you guys work through that, the next question is going to be, how prepared are you for the DSCSA state regulatory update? So we have very prepared, somewhat prepared, neutral, somewhat unprepared, and very unprepared. Just give it a couple of seconds while everybody rolls in. there's just a pretty big spurt. So, and obviously not applicable to any, law firms and consulting companies that are on the call today. So with that, I'll end the poll and share the results. So pretty good mix. For the first question is obviously internal compliance team is a clear leader with very little outsourcing. And then for the preparedness update, pretty much mixed between very prepared and neutral. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing that, and we can kind of move right along. Cool. So overview of the DSCSA. So President Obama signed the DSCSA back in 2013. Really, it's the DQSA, and the DSCSA was Title II. And so what that did is it established precise guidelines where federal law would preempt state law, basically established state regulatory standards for the entire country. Of course, the big pieces of it to come out of that was preemption of product tracing, pedigree requirements, as well as serialization and all of that. We're probably focused on a very small part of the law here, which is the preemption of state law and federal regulatory standards. And so to keep up with that, states have already started introducing new legislation. Again, that's something that Kelly's going to touch on later in this presentation. And the most important fact is that the precedent set by Alabama today, at least in our opinion, has a potential to set critical precedents nationwide. So going back to the proposed rules, what is it and what does it really cover? We released a 4-article series on it last year when it came out back in February 22. I think we took like 4 months to do it. And basically what it covers is that the FDA announced the proposed rule to provide guidelines for wholesale drug distributor and 3PL regulation for the state agencies, for state regulators. And what it does is it implements federal licensure requirements and federal licensure standards. And so now states must draft their own rules and regs to align with federal standards. All right, with that, I'll pass it over to Kelly.
Thanks, Amit. So it's clear there's a need for states to distinguish license types from one another. An example of where there's an issue when this doesn't happen is with Wyoming. So Wyoming licenses virtual entities. They license virtual manufacturers, but they license them as wholesalers. And wholesalers in Wyoming are required to obtain DDA or NCDQS accreditation. Therefore, so are virtual manufacturers. An early example of the DSCSA effects on state agencies is with Vermont. So in 2019, Vermont created manufacturers as its own license type, distinguishing them from wholesalers. This was problematic because existing manufacturers were already operating and licensed as wholesalers, but now had to obtain new licenses as manufacturers. This took upwards of 6 months for businesses that were already in operation, so it caused a disruption to licensure statuses for many businesses. So it's clear there's a need for separate licenses, but it has to be done in order to prevent massive disruption like in Vermont. There are states, though, that are starting to mirror the trend in Vermont, such as Alaska. On May 17th of this year, Alaska signed HB 1112 into law, which carves out the term manufacturer. So previously, manufacturers were licensed as wholesalers and fell within that definition. Additionally, Alaska has some proposed changes to its Board of Pharmacy regulations, such as creating manufacturer as its own license type, a renewal requirement biennially for manufacturers as its own license type, and renaming facility manager to designated representative in order to align with industry standards. That brings us to HB 79. So HB 79 was sponsored by Senator Bill Beasley, and it states that every manufacturer, bottler, packager, wholesale drug distributor, and other entities in the supply chain for pharmaceutical products must A, obtain an annual permit, and additionally designate a representative who must also register and pay an additional fee. So DSCSA requires that our state statutes and rules align with the federal standard in order to close the gap that exists among the states. One of those requirements is designating a facility representative. Or designated representative, rather, sorry. So there are some prerequisites and criteria that DRs generally have to meet, and more likely than not, with this being a registration, there's going to be a background check implemented. So likely Alabama will initiate a rulemaking so that they can clarify the registration requirements. But as they stand currently, the DR must be at least 21, a US citizen or legally present in the US, an employee of the entity full-time and in a position of authority, actively involved in and aware of the daily operations of the entity, physically present at the facility during regular business hours, and serve as the DR for only one entity at a time. Additionally, the DR cannot have been convicted of a violation of any federal, state, or local law relating to drug offenses, nor can they have been convicted, received adjudication, community supervision, or deferred prosecution of any felony offense or any crime related to fraud, violence, sexual violations, or related to the practice of pharmacy. Finally, the details of this registration are that in the legislation, it states that the fee is an annual registration fee and renewal fee of a minimum of $100. The renewal is due October 31st every year, and there's a potential penalty of a max of $50 for late renewals. The process will enable the board to effectively verify and evaluate DR candidates, but the background check could result in extended processing times. In other states where background checks are implemented on DR candidates, the states have to rely on a third-party agency in order to conduct the background check. So that causes those states to have much longer processing times than states without that requirement. So if a background check is implemented as part of the registration process for the DRs in Alabama, Alabama is currently at about 90 days processing. So it could look more like California, which is 120 days plus. Lastly, the DR registration requirement is set to become effective January 1st of 2024. Back to you, Smeet.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kelly. All right, so moving right along. So the floor versus ceiling debate. So this has been a pretty hotly contested debate for the last probably year or so. Probably before that too, it was kind of very passive because the law had passed in 2013. And nobody really knew what was going on, and there was not a lot of repercussions or consequences of the debate, and so it was kind of fell by the wayside. But that all changes now, and so specifically there's the heated debate is primarily located in the FDA comments to the FDA proposed rules by stakeholders, which focuses on whether federal standards will impose a floor and or a ceiling to state regulations. Generally, industry comments naturally, of course, kind of push for standards to impose both a floor and a ceiling, and so that states are not able to impose requirements that are more onerous than what was outlined in the standards, right? Obviously, that makes sense. Less regulation makes it easier to do business, makes it faster to do business, makes it cheaper to do business. And so that's kind of where industry is going, with support from various industry organizations. However, what we've seen is states are really doing the exact opposite of that. And so these are a handful of excerpts from the FDA comments. All of them are pretty direct and in their feelings and their understanding. So California Board of Pharmacy, for example, respectfully disagrees with the FDA's new interpretation. The new interpretation, of course, being it being a ceiling and a floor and not just a floor. And they base that on the language and purposes underlying the adoption of the DQSA and urges the FDA to revert to its previous preemption interpretation. Kentucky Board of Pharmacy, same thing, adamantly demands that the ceiling preemption language be reconsidered. And this is, the important part of it is, Kentucky really kind of goes into their being able to hold the authority to prove or deny a license for a wholesale drug distributor or 3PL based on the public's best interests and the health and safety of the Commonwealth. Otherwise, that it should be their decision and their decision alone. Additionally, the state licensing authority must be able to conduct routine inspection or inspections based on complaints submitted by members of the public. And so one of the standards really kind of focuses on inspections should naturally only be performed at time of renewal, which is also what North Carolina touches on. So North Carolina also pushes back on the concept of floor and ceiling and suggests that it should just be a floor. And they do that by focusing on their rule and standard of being able to inspect licensees more than once annually. Finally, Mississippi kind of rounds us out and says, just really attacks the the root cause of the problem, which is that they investigated and found no documentation to support a contemplation of standards being both the floor and ceiling, citing various case law, listed below, as well as, obviously in their comments. And so imposing the floor is not such a big deal for a lot of industry. It's not such a big deal for wholesale drug distributors, which we'll get to. It is, however, a pretty big deal for 3PLs. The first thing to know as far as preemption goes is that it's specifically limited to product tracing and licensure. And that's, all it's focused on. They don't go into all the other requirements, which we'll get to the next slide. So what that means, if it is limited to product tracing and licensure, what the floor means for 3PLs is that over 20 states are going to need to implement a 3PL licensing program. Alaska and Colorado and a few other states have already completely separated it out, the 3PL designation in a new license type. Kelly obviously did a great job, talking about, the inherent need for there to be different license types. Wyoming was a great example. At this time, Wyoming is lumping virtual manufacturers into their wholesale drug distributors. And, by law, a wholesale drug distributor needs accreditation. And so Wyoming is basically the only state to require accreditation for virtual manufacturers. Everybody else has little carve outs, like, Iowa has the limited distributor and, similar carve outs for other states, except Wyoming. Wyoming gets rolled into that. So that was a great point, Kelly. Thank you. States like Delaware have set the rules, but haven't released an application yet for the 3PL license. You'll see that really in the next point too. As well, Arkansas, states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Montana, Nevada, Oklahoma, Oregon, Tennessee, and Texas all have a specific 3PL designation within their wholesaler application. And that's going to be kind of interesting to see too, right? Is it going to have to be a specific license type for a 3PL, or is a designation as a 3PL under the wholesale license sufficient or not? Finally, 3 states will need to implement non-resident wholesale drug distributor licenses. As I mentioned last time, Puerto Rico, just like Delaware did for 3PLs, Puerto Rico has released legislation and regulations around a wholesale drug distributor non-resident license. The program to implement such is a little bit shaky, to say the least. We've had an office in Puerto Rico for almost 5 years now, and we're still trying to work with the Puerto Rico Department of Health to really flesh out those requirements and establish what the license application process is. And so to that end, Puerto Rico is not included on here because they kind of did already implement a licensing program for non-resident wholesale drug distributors. So the only ones that are left are Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Hawaii. Pennsylvania has already taken steps to comply with law. Specifically, they've introduced a surety bond requirement for resident wholesale drug distributors. And so we assume that they're going to be following that up with a non-resident wholesale drug distributor license. They've already taken some steps. It would be, not really foreseeable for them not to take the next step, right, which is the non-resident wholesale drug distributor license. And then so that leaves really out of the 3 states needing to implement a wholesale drug distributor program for non-resident wholesalers is Hawaii and Massachusetts. Both of those states have a controlled substance non-resident license. And so again, it's or some kind of controlled substance license and so on. And so it's foreseeable that they too follow suit with those licensing programs for non-resident wholesalers. All right, so imposing a ceiling and where to draw the line. So again, as mentioned in the last slide, the preemption is specifically focused on product tracing or pedigree, as well as licensing. It doesn't include all the other compliance requirements, which such as product registrations, drug take-back programs, opioid taxes, state price transparency reporting, self-inspection, and so on. And so the inspection cadence is one piece of that, right? So The standards kind of outline that inspections be done at initial license and at time of renewal. Does that disallow state regulators coming in unannounced on an ongoing basis, whether it's, in response to a complaint or in response to, something else? Are they allowed or they're not allowed to come in, which, it would essentially potentially be illegal for a state regulator to come in if it violates, federal standards and federal law. The next piece of it is prerequisites such as accreditation and designated representative licensure. So just because, there's federal standards around the license, the law really doesn't go into prerequisites for that license, right? And DR licensure, designated representative licensure, is kind of the crux of this presentation, obviously, with Alabama's new requirement. Does a prerequisite like designated representative licensure, does that count as being more onerous or more strict, or violating the quote unquote ceiling to the federal standards? Is a big question mark, right? So it could be such that the federal standards and industry and everybody's kind of understanding of designated representative licensure is not violating of the ceiling. But what's important to note is that California Board of Pharmacy specifically mentions their not being able to license designated representatives as a part of their comments in the FDA. So that's kind of the hot topic here, and that's really the crux of this. And really where this presentation kind of comes full circle is, if the designated representative licensure is more onerous, more strict, if that's the case, then it's our opinion that Alabama is taking the position that that there is no ceiling, that there's only a floor. Similarly, is it allowed, just like DR licensure, is it allowed for states to require accreditation in addition to as a prerequisite of wholesale drug licensure? Moving right along, one thing that doesn't really get a lot of attention but is obviously very important is additional and separate controlled substance licenses and permits. States like Illinois and in New York for a long time have had separate controlled substance licenses. In the case of Illinois, it's the same state agency. In the case of New York, it's a separate agency, right? It's the New York Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement, the B&E, which is separate and apart from the New York Board of Pharmacy underneath the Department of Education, right? So where does that come in? Is the B&E no longer allowed to establish and administer their license program to controlled substance wholesalers shipping from out of state into New York? Yes or no, right? Is Illinois allowed to add a controlled substance designation with an additional fee with a separate license number, right? I mean, it's the same license number with a couple of like a suffix or a prefix, but it is essentially a separate license, right? It's maintained and applied for separately than a wholesale drug distributor license. So how does that come into effect? Montana's opioid permit was obviously in response to the tragedy that is the opioid epidemic. Does that become illegal, right? It's a separate permit on top of and separate from their wholesale license program. Is that legal or is that not legal is a huge question. And then finally, operational requirements. I felt like I needed to mention this in addition to the prerequisites. Prerequisites we interpret internally here at LighthouseAI and Pharma Solutions as things that somebody needs to accomplish before they qualify for licensure. Operational requirements are those requirements that are a requirement to stay in compliance with laws after you have the license. So California, and I think it's Oregon and Washington, and as well as many other states, they have self-inspection requirements. Some states have controlled substance reporting. Tennessee and Texas, you have to report your controlled substance volume on an ongoing basis. Other states like California and Ohio have suspicious order monitoring reporting requirements. Are those in jeopardy, or are those okay to add in addition to and above state licensure? Is going to be another point of debate. And so really this slide kind of touches on the nuance, right? It's not just floor and a ceiling, or it's not really just the ceiling. Is if there is a ceiling, where do you kind of draw the line? Is it okay? So you have to have a license. Inspections at will are okay. States, you can have that. Is it you can add prerequisites like DR licensure and ABP accreditation? Can you have additional licenses for controlled substances? Can you add whatever kind of operational requirements in addition to state licensure? And so this is where I think we're going to see a lot of implementation. In our opinion, kind of at the last slide, it might get a little messy, right? So if the ceiling is upheld by the federal government, are states going to fight that? Are they going to sue the federal government's, pushing for their right to regulate wholesalers that are shipping drugs into their state? Yes or no? If a state like Alabama does go above and beyond the perceived understanding of what is a ceiling, such as designated representative licensure, which is something that the California Board of Pharmacy obviously sees as above and beyond state licensure, will industry sue them, right? Is it going to be an organization like the HDA, or is it going to be wholesalers, or is that just going to go by the wayside, and maybe it's not worth it to fight such a small requirement, right? But again, any small requirement times 52 jurisdictions with DC and Puerto Rico does become a big requirement. So that's kind of our takeaway. If not for a formal fight, there's going to be a lot of posturing and a lot of discussions and so on. So we're interested to see how that plays out. And how's it going to play out? It's going to play out, state by state, as everything, right? State boards are obviously waking up to federal standards. We provided a number of examples. Pennsylvania requiring a surety bond, Kelly's slide between Wyoming, Alaska, and Vermont, and so on. So we're going to see, this shake out over the next couple of years with a wave of legislative activities and rule modifications to follow. As we wrap up that piece of the presentation and go to the last slide, go to the last poll, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A. They're anonymous attendees, as everything I see so far. You can add your name if you like, and I'll add it to the presentation, but no need. So the question is, how prepared do you feel now? And we ask that because, now understanding that all the licenses that every company has in place, wholesalers and 3PLs, is gonna be invalidated at time of the enforcement or effectiveness of the new FDA proposed rules. 2 years after that, all of industry is gonna have to reapply for those licenses, right? 3PLs are gonna see a wave of new licensing programs across the states, and it's gonna happen, monthly, weekly, annually. Like we don't know what the cadence is because everything's gonna kind of follow the legislative tracks for each state. Wholesale drug distributors are being, subject to additional requirements like surety bonds, like designated representative licensure. And again, that's going to come ad hoc according to however the state, legislative process goes. And so wanted to see a quick poll at the end of the presentation here. Given all that information, how prepared do companies feel entering into this new regulatory change environments? It's going to be an onslaught of regulatory changes across the U.S. And so we'll pause it a couple of seconds here and poll and share results. I think we went from a 40% plus very prepared to an under 10% very prepared. So kind of what we were expecting. Right. So I'll stop sharing that. So compliance automation, obviously LighthouseAI is a product designed to help companies, with compliance. This is what everybody on this call is most likely familiar with: a very messy, very difficult, very onerous, path to compliance, journey to compliance. There's over 80 laws across, so many jurisdictions. And this is kind of the process that you have to take. It's a very manual, human-driven process to get to compliance, and you have to do it across all 52 jurisdictions. But if you zoom out, it's really only two things. It's what do I need to do, and is the first thing, and the second part of it is getting it done. Both of these are very understanding requirements is a very onerous and difficult task. In the past, it's always been primarily accomplished with people. Somebody has to sit down and read regulatory content, receive newsletters, stay on top of all the changes, see what's going on at the Board of Pharmacy meetings. What we've developed is a first-in-class product, a first-mover product, where you simply configure a facility based on over 100 attributes, controlled substances and different product portfolios, DME devices, prescription drugs. We have over 35 different product categories. We have over 50 questions or so, about 40 questions or so about business model. We ping that against our compliance knowledge database, and within about 90 seconds, you're told everything you need to do. And should anything change internally, you add products to your product portfolio, you add states in where you want to do business, you change your address, you change your ownership, whatever it might be, we keep you up to date with internal changes as well as external regulatory landscape changes. This Alabama DR requirement being the perfect use case for that information. And what does it provide? It's a comprehensive software solution to manage regulatory changes. Increased volume and speed of regulation will be difficult to manage. And so we have the first ever adaptable software to ensure seamless transitions and compliance. And you'll see us here. This is our DSCSA solutions map. We're really the only automation platform available today that provides ongoing updates to state regulatory requirements. So Q&A. We have 8 questions. This is always my favorite part. Please add your questions in the Zoom bar. All right. The first question is, which states, if any, have already surrendered 3PL and or wholesale drug distributor licensure to the feds? Really, at this time, it's no state. So how that's going to work in our understanding is, after these proposed rules, we're in the comment period, then there's going to be the rulemaking period, and it's going to get passed. And then there's going to be, I think, a 3-year stay until those rules are enforced, which gives us a chance for state and industry to catch up. And that's where we're really going to see the brunt of all the regulatory changes happen really quickly across all 52 jurisdictions. And so once that happens, at that time, the federal government or the states are going to make the decision to surrender their licensure and their regulation to the federal government. So thank you very much for that question. The next question is, my pharma companies, maybe Kelly, you can take this one. My pharma company is licensed across the US, and for the most part, I know that a lot of states have already some of the rules in place, such as designated representative, licensure, and surety bond requirements. If we already have these in place, we won't have to do anything further.
I mean, I think it depends on the state. I mean, if it's a state that has a separate registration or license for the DR, or already a bond requirement, I can't see that changing much further, but likely there's going to be more states that you're going to be required to obtain that additional registration or bond in, as the states catch on. And, it's sort of going to be like a domino effect, I think, as we can see with Alaska, for example.
Yep, exactly right. I would exactly echo Kelly's response. You don't have anything to do with the stuff you already have in place, but the whole point of this is that there's new regulations, new requirements coming out every day, every week, every month. And that's really the above and beyond that, that all companies, about 15,000 companies across the US are going to have to comply with. So thank you, Ashley, for that question. Floor versus ceiling. Oh, I apologize if I didn't make this clear. So the federal standards, so the DSCSA contemplates that there must be national standards for state regulation, so that, obviously state regulation is kind of a patchwork. If you go back 30 years, some states had some states had licensing programs, other states didn't, and so on. And so a floor simply means that there's a minimum set of requirements for state licensure and state regulation, right? A minimum. So that's the floor. And then the ceiling is that there's a maximum that that you cannot be more strict than what the federal standards say. So the floor is you can be more strict. The ceiling says you can't be more strict. And so what I mean by more strict really kind of depends on, this slide, right? There's 4 different types of potentials, right? Is there additional different licensing, or prerequisites? Are they talking about inspection cadence? Are they talking about operational requirements? So like the floor is, the federal standards have some kind of notion, or sometimes they do, sometimes they don't talk about these various aspects. And so where do we draw the line for the ceiling is really, what that means. I hope that answers your question. All right, heading back to the Q&A. Why would states want to surrender this licensure to the feds? Great question from a state regulatory agency. And so that's a really good question. We don't really know, and we don't really totally see that happening. Part of it is, I think there's a couple of things at play here. I think one of the most important things is that I think it might be more of a, I don't want to say scare tactic, but it's the only way that the federal government has to enforce their national standards. Basically, hey, look, if you're not compliant with the national standards, what would their other options be? Would the FDA have to take them to court? And that's going to be an awkward and usually not typically done. So I think what they're trying to say is that if you don't comply, we're going to take away your requirement, right? And so I don't think any state is going to purposefully surrender this licensure to the feds. Obviously, there are some states that outsource or rely on, I should say, really rely on organizations like the NEBP or NCDQS to administer accreditation. And so once you have accreditation in a handful of states, it's pretty straightforward to get the rest of the license. It's just a matter of sending in money and an application. There's not a lot of due diligence. Some states like Michigan have even outsourced some of their inspections to national organizations like the NEBP. I think Michigan is probably a good example. And so it could be a number of things. It could just be focus. It could be budget. It could be it could be a number of things. So that's a really good question, and we'll wait to find out. I think generally those, especially for wholesale drug distributor licensure and 3PL, mostly states do seem like they're going to jump on board, which is part of our which was part of our presentation. So we'll have to see. Thank you very much. All right. We have questions keep growing. I think we started with 4 and now we're at 9. What does this mean for NCDQS and NEBP? Will they be working with the FDA? So that really remains to be seen. The NEBP has obviously released some somewhat controversial commercial solutions that we're still waiting to figure out what we see. Their NEBP especially is in a great position to leverage their relationships with state regulators as well as their industry brand name and so on to kind of push their products along and whatnot. So and as well, NEBP has a very diversified business model. They administer pharmacist tests and NAPLEX and all that fun stuff. So we'll see what it means for NEBP. If anything, they have about 700 facilities accredited, and I think they charge about $4,000 a year for their accreditation. So however much that money comes out to isn't probably going to make a huge dent in their $100 million war chest, which is again is public information as a nonprofit. So I don't think it means too much for NEBP. For NCDQS has a very strong inspection program. I think almost 100 companies have used their inspection program across the U.S. And so, it's just diversifying and so on. But I hope that answers your question. Yeah, and what a state regulator just mentioned as far as a comment in the form of a question is, we don't want to turn this over to the federal government for sure, and we want to know who's bringing drugs in the state. Absolutely, and that makes perfect sense. I presented in front of the Alabama Board of Pharmacy, and they're requiring contract manufacturers to have a license and be to have a license, right? So like 1 or 2 steps removed from a sale or a shipment into Alabama. They want to know who's making the product going all the way back. Obviously, Oklahoma has that same requirement also for international drug manufacturers. So we definitely see where the state regulators are coming from. Their mission is to protect the public safety, right? To patient safety and their constituents. So yeah, that's no surprise that the state boards of pharmacy and departments of health have a huge task at hand, and industry I think is just sees red tape or whatever a lot of times, but at the end of the day it's all about patient safety, and so fully recognize that fact, and thank you for adding that. Moving right along, are they doing this for down the road when we may see overseas export? So there's a lot of export right now. I think maybe the question is if we onshore drug manufacturing, as was a big piece of COVID, that we want to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. away from India and China and so on. I don't think that has anything to do with this, or it doesn't have a lot to do with this. I think wholesaler national standards around wholesaling and 3PL is really to protect the supply chain, prevent counterfeiting, prevent drug diversion, prevent all these things that may introduce substandard drugs for U.S. patients, not necessarily exporting. So good question, but yeah, I think it's very much focused on that. All right. What does it look? Oh shoot! I can't believe I didn't touch on this. What does it look like for manufacturers who are exempt from the wholesaler requirements of the DSCSA? Phenomenal question. I'm almost sorry I didn't spend much more time on this. So in general, manufacturers are generally, I said that already, generally not included as far as the national standards go, right? They're not included, in any of the language or anything is 3PLs and wholesale drug distributors. Now, I think this is going to have massive repercussions for manufacturers. Vermont and Alaska, Kelly touched on, but a big thing is Wyoming, right? When Wyoming goes to revisit their requirements to add, 3PLs and add, whatever other standards that they may need to focus on. I'm not an expert on Wyoming. That's what Kelly and Jessica's job is. But if and when they do revisit their licensing programs, it is very foreseeable that Wyoming also revisits their manufacturer licensing program, because having a virtual manufacturer be roped into wholesale drug distributor licensure, and as a result of that, have to be the only state in the U.S. that effectively requires a virtual manufacturer to get accreditation as a part of licensure is very unforeseeable, right? In the past, there was, any accreditation was kind of required for virtual manufacturers in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania doesn't have a full license program for them. But yeah, we really see that as states revisit licensing programs and whatnot, the model rule and so on is going to accommodate all these different business models, including 3PLs, of course, as required by law, but also business models like manufacturers. So great question. Thank you for that. And again, we see so much for manufacturers already, right? There's opioid taxes and state price transparency requirements, all different phenomenon coming from the last decade of price transparency, being brought into political forefront. opioid epidemic being brought in the political forefront and so on. So manufacturers already have a lot of attention on them. And so we see a lot of revisions around licensing programs for them. Kelly or Jessica, anything to add there? Just keep on going.
Yeah, really quickly. So if that question was directly relating to the DR requirement, it does seem to apply to manufacturers. I know typically we see states like Florida where the DR requirement is directly relating to the wholesaler license. But, Kelly did read off the business models defined in the House bill, and manufacturers, repackagers, they were all defined there. So it doesn't really seem like it's going to be something where Alabama reserves that just for wholesalers in this case. It does seem like it's going to affect manufacturers.
I believe the only exemptions really are pharmacies and outsourcing facilities, from what I understand.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. And so, how do you see this? That kind of goes into this additional question, which is, how do you see this Alabama precedent realistically changing other state requirements? Now that Alabama has put out a designated representative license, California has one, Florida has one, I think Idaho has one. It is foreseeable that additional states add a designated representative license to their licensing programs, especially because they're going to be revisiting their licensing programs over the coming years to accommodate stuff mandated by the federal standards like 3PL licensing, as well as to accommodate how industry has evolved, right? 30 years ago, virtual manufacturing might not have been top of mind, but it absolutely is now, because as we become more efficient, the way generic pricing is going, it's made a lot of sense for companies to act super lean and outsource as much as possible. And so that's how we see this Alabama precedent realistically change other state requirements. All right. Do we have to apply for designated representative license in Alabama before January 1st, 24? Actually, I'm not aware of that. Kelly, Jessica, do you guys know?
I don't believe it's technically effective until then, per the legislation. So they're going to take time to have to develop what the registration actually looks like. Is it a form? Is it an online app? Are they going to change the requirements as they are today? Are they going to have a background check requirement? So I'm not aware of it being required prior to that date.
Yeah, and being that Alabama renews 12/31 every year, most likely the state's going to allow you all to renew your permits, and then that's going to be something that you have to adhere to when it actually goes into effect.
Got it. Great. So what is the federal date? I think we might have covered that already. The federal date is going to be, I think they updated it to 3 years after the rule is made effective, or is it 2 years? It might be 2 or 3 years after the rule is made effective. We see that, because we're still in comment, they've been accepting comments for like the comment acceptance period is closed, but they've been working to work through the comments the FDA has for the last, 6 months, 9 months. I think it closed in September of last year, so I guess 9 months now. So we see the law being passed in the next year and a half, and then 2 or 3 years thereafter. So that's the federal date. But so we saw quite a bit of time. I think Kelly mentioned this does not affect retail pharmacies, at least the Alabama piece doesn't. When all the states revisit their licensing programs, especially states like Georgia, everything's considered technically a pharmacy. Those are different classes of pharmacy. Same thing in Utah, class A, B, C, D, E. I know in Utah, class E is just kind of like a free-for-all, catch-all. 3PLs and DME companies and so on are all kind of captured in the class E license. It's foreseeable that retail pharmacy programs are all also revisited, along with obviously, of course, manufacturers. But we'll see how that shakes out state by state, really. All right, the FDA rule was only proposed isn't one solution to the inspectional cadence issue. So how often states can come in is to ask FDA in the final rule to allow for cause inspections and otherwise allow states to inspect if they have reason to believe there's unlawful activity or to otherwise set a more frequent cadence. So I guess, Kelly, to help clarify around, these four pieces, I mean, would you agree that the FDA can just kind of provide more guidance around all four of these different pieces?
Yeah, I don't think it's clear enough presently whether that would be something that's permitted or not. It could potentially be, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess to kind of piggyback on that, we'll see how the FDA takes the floor versus ceiling comments. I mean, they could just take a step back and say, it's just a floor, there's no ceiling, or they could say a ceiling and it's these very specific things. So yeah, we don't really know how it's going to shake out, but FDA can take leadership here and kind of nip this in the bud and address these issues before they really become issues, right? Oh, thank you for the information. Tish advised that FDA anticipates releasing a final rule in April 2025, so about 2 years from today. Thank you very much for that information. Jessica or Kelly, can you, somebody asked about the Idaho license requirements for designated representatives. Can you guys back me up on that? Or any information there?
Yeah, so
so
I believe it's a registration. Sorry, go ahead. It's not an actual license. It's just it's a registration with the board. I don't even know if there's an additional fee. Maybe Jess.
I don't know off the top of my head, but it is a requirement that renewals are signed off by that registered DR in Idaho. So you can't even renew your license if you don't have a registered DR. So again, not so much of a license as Kelly mentioned, but certainly a requirement.
Yeah. And I think this is really where it's really going to get down into the weeds, right? I mean, imposing ceiling, where to draw the line. Is a DR license above the ceiling? If it is, what about a DR registration, right? Does it count if there's a fee or there's no fee? Does it count if there's an extra piece of paper or not an extra piece of paper form? And so on. So this is where, state regulation gets really messy because all these states have different rules, different laws, different agencies promulgate rules based on those laws, different agencies to enforce on those laws, right? And agencies are made of people. So, we've seen so many times in Nevada and South Carolina where there's no rule change, there's no law change, but there's a, oversight change, the board of pharmacy executive director change, and all of a sudden, the goalposts have moved a little bit. So just part of the challenge of state regulation. And again, that's where our LighthouseAI intelligence product really comes into play. Is we account for all those specific nuances. We don't just say, hey, are you a wholesaler, or are you a pharmacy, or a 3PL? We really dive deep into 100+ attributes of a company that actually drive compliance. So there's some information there. And Wanda, thank you very much. To back us up, Idaho does require a background check for the designated representative. So another great question, like where's that line drawn as far as the ceiling goes? All right, where's that 2-3 year deadline? Is that part of DSCSA language or an FDA guidance? I actually think it has to do with the proposed rules. There was actually discrepancy between when the wholesale drug distributor proposed rules were put in effect and when the 3PL rules were put into effect. I think FDA was kind of thinking about how stuff is going to change, right? 3PLs, states have to implement a bunch of different regulations. A lot of states do. There's over 20+ states that don't have a licensing program. So I think that's probably why they gave them an extra year. But I think a lot of comments and whatnot kind of seek to align them both to 3 years. So that is part of the FDA proposed rules. I don't know, Kelly, if Jessica, you do anything to add to that, or maybe correct me. All good?
Yeah, just that, to your point, it's taken most of the states 2 to 3 years past the deadline to actually create 3PL licensure requirements. Then Colorado was the most recent in 2021. And that was supposed to be something in place, before 2019. So it's probably not something where deadlines are necessarily going to be met on time. It's red tape, and it's not, something that can be done overnight.
Great. Do you guys know, is the DR requirement implication in Alabama for non-residents or residents or both?
I don't think they have separate licenses for, there's not separate applications in Alabama. And I don't think the legislation really makes any distinction between resident or non-resident. So I think it would be both.
Cool. Thank you, Kelly. Great. Do I need a plan for the growth of the designated representative role for my company? I can jump in there. It really just kind of depends on your specific situation, how long you've been in business, and so forth. We've had a lot of situations where like a founder or owner of a new wholesaling company or new 3PL acts as the DR, and then as their team and our operations manager or whatever gets the appropriate qualifications and really experience in place, then the DR role is passed on. As far as growth of the DR role, I don't think the responsibilities or the duties are going to be changing with this new requirement. There's going to be additional requirements on that DR, such as like a background check and so forth. But I don't think operationally you need to plan for the growth of the DR role for the company. But again, your mileage may vary just depending on your specific situation. Great. And Tish actually provided the link to the rules, so I'll go ahead and drop that into the chat. And then finally, there is a question. Do you have any views on the preemption analysis by the HTA submitted in its comments? Those comments anticipated state objections. I actually have not seen it, unfortunately. So I can't really speak to it. Jessica, do you have anything?
No, I have not
Sorry.
seen that.
You look like you needed to speak. So yeah, we can double click on it there. If you have any insights into that, please feel free to share in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'll make sure to look at it and perhaps even write a little article about it or something. So thank you for that information. Great. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. We sincerely appreciate your time. Thank you, Jessica and Kelly, for joining me today. We hope that this presentation was helpful and insightful. We're here to help, so please reach out if needed. Thank you so much, everybody.